Nestled deep within the Sierra Nevada mountains, where pine needles soften every footstep and the wind hums through old wooden cabins, lies a place that time has quietly abandoned. A place called Keddie. Once a popular railroad resort in Northern California, Keddie now slumbers beneath towering firs and ancient oaks, forgotten by many, remembered by few. The roads that once welcomed summer families and passing train crews now curl in silence, dusted with needles and memory. The air smells faintly of damp earth and rusted tin roofs. Time moves slowly here, as if the forest itself is reluctant to let go of what it's seen. It is in this stillness, this hush between trees, that Cabin 28 once stood. And within its walls lined with knotty pine and patched wallpaper, an unspeakable mystery unfolded. But we won't speak in fear. We will wander through the story, as though walking a forest path at twilight, slowly, softly, noticing the details. A stray newspaper on the porch, a photograph on the wall, a sound of distant footsteps, never quite approaching. This is not a tale of terror. It is a story of people, of silence, and of questions left behind. A mystery rooted in moss and mountain air. Tonight, we open the door to Cabin 28 and step gently inside. In the early 1900s, the Keddie Resort was a bustling stopover, a patchwork of cabins nestled beside the Western Pacific Railroad. Travelers disembarked here for trout fishing, mountain air, and the soft lullaby of passing trains. There were lanterns glowing in windows, laughter echoing from porches, and summer evenings filled with the scent of pine smoke and frying fish. But by the 1970s, the spark had faded. The railroad brought fewer guests. The paint on the cabins began to peel. Keddie, once alive with vacationers, became a haven for those seeking low-cost housing, away from city noise and scrutiny. A quiet pocket of wilderness, serene but slowly sinking into neglect. Cabin 28 sat close to the heart of it, modest and weathered. Its windows faced the tree line, its porch shaded by an overhanging pine. Inside, rooms were small but serviceable. A living room with 2 sofas, a tiny kitchen, 3 bedrooms, a single bathroom. No insulation, no central heat, just thin walls and thicker woods. Neighbours came and went, most kept to themselves. Children played among the trees, and yet there was a stillness to Keddie, as though something watched from between the trunks. By the spring of 1981, the resort had just a handful of families. One of them was the Sharps, recent arrivals from Connecticut, hoping for peace, perhaps a fresh start. They would not find it here. Glenna Susan Sharp, known to most as Sue, arrived in Keddie in the fall of 1980. Recently separated, she had driven cross-country with her 5 children, seeking stability, affordability, and distance from a troubled past. Cabin 28, though humble, offered her a roof and a new beginning. Her children, John, Sheila, Tina, Rick, and Greg, adapted quickly. They attended nearby Quincy schools, made friends in the resort's small circle of families, and filled the cabin with the ordinary chaos of after-school chatter, spilled cereal, and Sue was quiet, described by neighbours as reserved, polite, and often seen reading on the porch. She worked part-time, received support from her brother, and occasionally took typing classes. Her life was simple, almost invisible, but not unkind. John, the eldest at 15, was protective. Tina, only 12, was thoughtful and often close to her mother. Sheila, bright and responsible, often helped with the younger boys. They were not perfect, few families are, but they were trying. Keddie was meant to be a place to rebuild. There were friends. John had recently met Dana Wingate, a quiet teen with long hair and thoughtful eyes. Tina had become close with a neighbour girl. Sue occasionally confided in those she trusted. About her ex-husband, about her hopes, about her unease, because even in this wooded quiet, Sue sometimes felt watched. She had told a friend once that she was uneasy about someone in town, but she never named who. And on one spring weekend, something or someone shattered everything she had tried to build. Friday, April 10th, 1981, drifted into Keddie like any other spring evening. The trees swayed softly in the mountain air, and the light faded early, casting the cabins in long shadows. A hush settled over the valley, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the crunch of gravel under distant footsteps. Inside cabin 28, the Sharp family prepared for the weekend. Sue stayed in for the evening, likely folding laundry or writing letters, small, grounding tasks. Sheila made plans to sleep over at a neighbouring cabin with her friend. John and Dana had gone into Quincy that afternoon, perhaps for a movie, perhaps just a walk and talk beneath the neon buzz of the small town strip. Tina had spent part of the evening watching television at another home nearby. Around 9:30 p.m, she returned to cabin 28. Rick and Greg, the youngest boys, had invited a friend to stay over, a boy named Justin, who lived just a few cabins away. By all accounts, the night unfolded quietly. Lights dimmed, voices lowered, and doors locked for the night. Beyond the thin cabin walls, the forest breathed in its usual rhythm, steady, cool, indifferent. No one noticed anything strange, no loud noises, no shouts, just the slow drip of time as midnight came and passed. And then nothing until morning. It was just after 7 a.m. on April 12th when 14-year-old Sheila Sharp made her way back toward cabin 28. She had spent the night next door with the Seabolt family, as planned. The morning was quiet, blanketed in that familiar high-altitude stillness. a sound she barely noticed. As she reached the cabin, nothing seemed out of place. The front door was slightly ajar. Odd, perhaps, but not alarming. She pushed it open, and then she stopped. Inside, the living room was dark, but she could see shapes. A toppled table, blankets on the floor, then the unmistakable presence of bodies, still and tangled in disarray. Her mind could not grasp it at first. Only the silence told her something was terribly wrong. Sheila didn't scream. She didn't step forward. She turned and ran. The Seabolts called the sheriff. The first officers arrived not long after. They moved through the narrow entrance, flashlights sweeping over the scene. 3 victims, bound with tape and wire, bludgeoned and slashed. John Sharp, his friend Dana, and Sue, the mother, left closest to the wall. Oddly, the back bedroom was untouched. Inside, the youngest boys, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin, were still asleep, unhurt, unaware. They hadn't stirred during the night. But Tina was gone. The cabin remained strangely quiet as deputies moved from room to room. No signs of forced entry. No shattered windows, just a slow, almost surreal stillness. As if the home itself had exhaled and gone still sometime in the night. In the front room, blood marked the walls and floor. A telephone cord had been pulled from the wall. A kitchen knife and a bent hammer rested nearby. Nothing about the arrangement made sense. Brutal, yet somehow methodical. No signs of a struggle from the victims. No evidence of escape. The boys' room, in contrast, felt untouched by violence. Rick and Greg sat silently, still groggy. Justin said little. He seemed confused, unsure of what he had seen or heard. Perhaps he had slept through it. Perhaps not. Sue's body had been partially covered with a sheet. That detail stood out, covered as if by someone who knew her, or someone who felt something, even in the aftermath. In Tina's room, nothing. No signs of a struggle. No note, no clue. The cabin door had been left open, the telephone disabled. No footprints in the damp soil. No tire tracks that could be trusted. Keddie was not a place for surveillance or street lamps. Just trees, so many trees, and the only girl unaccounted for was 12 years old. Tina Sharp had been home that night. Of that everyone was certain. She had returned from a neighbour's house shortly after 9:30 p.m. Quiet, reserved, perhaps tired. she would have slipped into her room as the household settled down for the night. But by morning, she was gone, not among the living, not among the dead. A missing child adds a shadow of its own to any tragedy, but in this case, her absence felt deliberate. There was no forced window, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a desperate escape or hasty abduction. Just absence. At first, some wondered if she had fled in terror, escaping into the woods. Others suggested she'd been taken, removed from the scene by someone who hadn't wanted her found. The mountains around Keddie were vast. Pines stretched endlessly in every direction. A child in those woods would be nearly impossible to spot from the air, especially in the cool, shaded hours before dawn. Deputies scoured the forest on foot and horseback. Dogs combed nearby trails. Helicopters circled the valley. But the trees offered no clues, no shoe prints, no fabric caught on brambles, no sound, only stillness. And as each day passed, the question grew heavier. Why had Tina been taken when the others had been left behind? In the days that followed, search parties formed with quiet urgency. Volunteers from the community, rangers from nearby stations, and officers from the Plumas County Sheriff's Department gathered under the boughs of the forest, moving in careful lines through brush and thicket. The air carried the scent of moss and ash. Rain fell intermittently, softening the forest floor, erasing what little evidence might have remained. Voices called Tina's name. Radios crackled faintly. But there was no response. The Feather River wound nearby, deep and dark in places. Crews checked the banks. Divers scanned beneath the surface. Still nothing. The FBI joined the case briefly. It was, after all, a missing child, but as the hours stretched into days and the days into weeks, momentum slowed. The forest remained silent. Tina had vanished. Sue's sister and other relatives waited for news with a kind of suspended grief. One loss had been confirmed. 3 lives taken in a single night. But Tina's fate floated in limbo. And that uncertainty was its own kind of cruelty. The case grew colder with every passing sunrise, but still, cabin 28 remained. Empty now, quiet again, as if waiting for someone to return. Investigators knocked on doors and walked quiet driveways. Neighbors began to speak. Softly, hesitantly of what they had seen or thought they had seen. One couple, living just across the lane, recalled hearing what sounded like muffled voices that night, perhaps arguing, perhaps not. Another neighbour mentioned headlights briefly flickering near cabin 28 around 1 a.m. But no one could say more. Nothing definitive, just fragments. Later, a man living in an adjacent cabin would claim he awoke to what sounded like screaming, though he hadn't left his bed to check. It hadn't lasted long. The kind of sound that wakes you, unsettles you, and then fades into the stillness before you can place it. Someone else recalled seeing two men, unknown to the area, loitering around the general store a few days prior. One tall and dark-haired, the other lighter with a moustache. Their presence had seemed odd at the time, but not alarming. Keddie wasn't the kind of place people locked their doors tightly. The sketch that would later emerge, years later, matched those vague descriptions. But in 1981, no one followed up. No names were given. No composite was drawn. Just murmurs. Just unease. And in the still woods surrounding Keddie, unease has a way of lingering. Among the victims found that morning were not only Sue and her eldest son John, but also a teenage boy named Dana Wingate. He was just 17. Dana had recently become close friends with John. He was thoughtful, a little reserved, a kind of boy who often listened more than he spoke. He came from nearby Quincy, where life was slow, and families knew one another by name. On the evening of April 11th, John and Dana had hitchhiked into town. They likely watched a film at the local theatre, Love at First Bite, some remembered, and then stopped briefly at a gas station. The last confirmed sighting was around 9:30 p.m. as they made their way back to Keddie. They must have arrived at cabin 28 not long after. Shoes removed, voices low, perhaps the end of a long, ordinary day. What happened next, no one knows. But their bodies were later found bound, wrists and ankles tied, with white tape and electrical wire. The brutality of the scene stood in sharp contrast to the boys' soft features and quiet lives. Dana had no connection to the town beyond his friendship with John. Yet something or someone had brought him into that room on that night. And as with much of the case, it raised a quiet, persistent question. Was this random or personal? Plumas County wasn't equipped for crimes like this. The sheriff's department had little experience with homicides, let alone a case this complex. Leads were slow to form. Statements went uncollected. Evidence sat unattended. Early on, 2 names surfaced, both men known to the community. One had a history with Sue. The other had once lived with a Sharp family acquaintance. One of them, it was said, had even failed a polygraph, yet neither was arrested. Neither was charged. In fact, much of the early investigation seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Files were misfiled, notes were lost. Some evidence, including a tape-recorded confession given years later, was quietly ignored. Why? Some have suggested incompetence. Others whisper about fear, that the case touched deeper roots in the town, and that those involved were protected, whether deliberately or by negligence. The FBI eventually stepped back. Media coverage dwindled. The weight of it all seemed to settle on the survivors and on a handful of investigators who never truly let it go. But even they would later admit key opportunities were missed, and perhaps intentionally so. It wasn't until years later, in 1984, that a new sketch emerged. 2 men, described by a witness who had been only a child at the time, were finally rendered in charcoal and ink. One had long dark hair and a narrow face. The other was stockier with a thick moustache. Both were seen near the Sharps' cabin around the time of the murders. Both, the child remembered, had made him feel uncomfortable. Why it took 3 years to release this image remains a puzzle. The witness, it turned out, had tried to describe these men before, but his account had been largely dismissed. Perhaps he was too young. Perhaps no one had truly listened. Now older and under hypnosis, he recalled more details. The way they spoke, the way they watched the cabin, the way their voices rose and then fell like a storm forming just beyond the ridge. When the sketch was finally shared, some in town nodded in recognition. Others stayed quiet, and as with so much in Keddie, it was too little, too late. 3 years passed. Tina Sharp remained missing, her name spoken in hushed tones, her photo still pinned to corkboards in cafes and county buildings. But gradually the search waned. The mountains reclaimed the silence, and life, as it often does, moved on, though never fully. Then, in April of 1984, a bottle collector was walking along a stretch of forested terrain near Feather Falls roughly 100 miles south of Keddie. It was quiet there, dry, sun-dappled, with brittle leaves covering the forest floor. Among the scattered glass and underbrush, the man spotted something unusual. At first he thought it was a fragment of animal bone, pale and curved. But as he moved closer, his breath caught. It was a human skull. Authorities arrived swiftly. The scene was carefully combed. With the skull were other remains, vertebrae, a jawbone, and fragments of clothing, a faded blue jacket, a blanket partly buried, nearby a child's shoe. Dental records would later confirm the truth. It was Tina, 12 years old, missing for 3 years. Her body had been left in a place so remote, so quiet, that even time seemed hesitant to disturb it. And with that discovery, the case was no longer only a mystery. It was a tragedy now stretching across counties, years and lives. The Feather Falls site was scoured for further clues. The earth there was dry, loamy, easy to dig but difficult to trace. Any footprints or disturbances had long since been erased by weather, animals and time. Still, certain items lingered. The blue nylon jacket, believed to be Tina's, was torn in places. A fragment of blanket, possibly from the Sharp household, was tangled in undergrowth. There were pieces of bone, small and scattered, but no weapons, no tire tracks, no campfire remains, and no clear cause of death. The skull had signs of trauma, but investigators could not definitively say what had happened. The distance between Keddie and Feather Falls was striking. Over 2 hours by road. Someone had taken Tina there, through mountain roads and forest trails, and left her in silence. But why so far? Some believed she had been taken immediately after the murders, a panicked decision. Others wondered if she had been kept alive for a time. The forensic evidence was too degraded to say for certain. The official cause of death remained undetermined, but the forest had given back what it had held. And in that act, however small, a measure of truth returned to the story. Even in those early hours, clues had whispered from every corner of cabin 28. A steak knife, its blade bent from force. A second knife, partially cleaned. A hammer, missing entirely. Medical tape and electrical cord cut into segments. Blood patterns that suggested movement, not a sudden burst, but a grim, deliberate progression. Sue's body had been posed, her injuries distinct from the others. Some believed she had been the primary target, others disagreed. John and Dana bore signs of struggle. They had fought, it seemed, but not loudly enough to wake the boys in the next room, or perhaps they had been silenced swiftly. No valuables were taken. The television remained. A wallet lay undisturbed. Nothing about the scene hinted at robbery. This was not the work of strangers looking for gain, but of familiarity, of resentment. Years later, a hammer matching the missing description was found near a local pond, corroded but potentially linked. It had not been logged at the time of the crime, and by then its story was lost to rust. Still, for those who study cases like these, details matter. A bent blade, a missing hammer, a body covered, a phone line severed, not random, not rage alone, something colder, something unfinished. Years after the murders, in the early 2000s, a startling development emerged, quietly and without the attention it perhaps deserved. A man named Justin, the childhood friend who had slept over that night in cabin 28, had long carried fragments of memory. As he grew older, those fragments became sharper. Under hypnosis, he had recalled figures in the dark, voices raised, a woman pleading. But the most disturbing revelation came not from him, but from a therapist treating another man, a known associate of one of the early suspects. During a session, this man allegedly confessed that he had witnessed the murders, that he had been there. He spoke of Tina, of what had happened to her. He named names. He described the layout of the cabin in intimate detail. The therapist, bound by duty, relayed the confession to authorities. The report was filed and then quietly shelved. No arrest followed, no charges, no search. Why? To this day, no one truly knows. Some believe the confession was considered unreliable, tainted by time or mental illness. Others suspect something deeper, that the confession had come too close to someone protected, someone shielded. Whatever the reason, the man died not long after. His story and his guilt, if it was guilt, went with him, and the file, like so many others in this case, slipped into silence. By the early 2000s, cabin 28 still stood, weathered, vacant, and heavy with memory. It had become a quiet destination for the curious. Some came to take photographs. Others simply stood at its edge, wondering. Its windows were dark. Its paint had faded to grey. Nature was reclaiming it. Vines curling along the porch railings, moss threading up the walls. And then, without warning, it was gone. In 2004, cabin 28 was demolished. The decision came without public announcement. No ceremony, no memorial, just a final act of erasure. Some believed it was for safety. The building had long since fallen into disrepair. Others whispered it was something else, a desire to remove the lingering questions, to let the ground settle again, to bury the past beneath pine needles and silence. Today the site is overgrown, a patch of forest where memory breathes between the trees. No plaque marks the spot, no sign indicates what once stood there, but for those who remember, and there are many, the outline of the cabin remains, not in boards and nails, but in absence, and in stories that refuse to fade. Sue Sharp was 40 years old when her life ended in cabin 28. A mother of 5, a survivor in her own quiet way. She had grown up in Connecticut, married young, raised her children with care. When her marriage began to unravel, she made a choice few others would. She left, took her children, moved west. She wanted a fresh start, a quiet place, the chance to breathe again. Keddie offered affordability, if not safety. She lived simply, made ends meet, and did what she could to give her children stability. Neighbours recall her as soft-spoken, polite, occasionally reserved, but present. She listened more than she spoke, and she protected her children fiercely. There are some who believe Sue knew something, that she had reason to be afraid in those final weeks, that she may have confided in someone, a fear, a name, a secret. But if she did, no one has ever confirmed it. In the end, her story is one of strength and sorrow. She did what many would not. She tried to start again, to write a different chapter, and for a time she did, until someone took it away. Why, Keddie? That question lingers, even now, softly, like wind through the trees. Of all places, why this forgotten resort, nestled in a mountain pass few had heard of, and fewer still called home? Some say it was because it was easy to disappear there, a place where shadows outnumbered street lights, where cabins sat apart and no one asked too many questions. Others believe it was simply chance, that Sue Sharp, like so many, had sought out affordability, not knowing what silence might conceal. But the deeper one looks, the more Keddie reveals. By the 1980s, the resort had become a refuge for those on the margins. Low-income families, people starting over, and a few drifting figures who passed in and out without notice. The kind of place where stories gathered in corners and whispers echoed louder than facts. Sue was not the only woman in Keddie who had mentioned feeling watched, nor the only one who had left warning signs, faint, uncertain, but real. And the cabin itself, with its thin walls and aging floorboards, was not built to keep danger out. It had always been open to the forest and to whatever, or whoever, moved through it that night. Some think the answers were never in the evidence, but in the people. People who knew, who suspected, who stayed silent. Of the many names that floated around Keddie in the months after the murders, one surfaced again and again, quietly, reluctantly. He was known to the Sharps, had once lived with a woman connected to the family. He was familiar, but not trusted, and he had a history of anger, of volatility, of strange disappearances from town at odd hours. More than one witness placed him near the cabin on the night of the murder. A composite sketch released years later bore a startling resemblance. Still, no charges were filed. Years after the crime, a former sheriff's deputy would publicly claim that this man had confessed. Not once, but twice. Once to his own therapist, and later in a private conversation. But each time, the claims were dismissed, labelled hearsay, unprovable, irrelevant. The man eventually moved away, started over, perhaps, left behind the forest, the cabin, and the quiet weight of what he may have done. But in Keddie his name remains, not shouted, not written in bold, just murmured behind closed doors, between trees. Today, little remains of Keddie as it once was. The railroad no longer stops there. The general store has long since closed. The cabins stand in varying states of collapse and memory. Nature has begun its slow reclamation. Ferns curling through broken windows, pine needles blanketing forgotten paths. Where cabin 28 once stood, only foundation stones remain, half swallowed by earth. The clearing feels quieter than the rest of the forest, as though even the birds keep their distance. Still, some return, former residents, curious travellers, amateur sleuths with cameras and questions. They walk the gravel paths, searching for something, a feeling, a clue, a sense of closure. But the forest offers few answers, only echoes, only silence. The murders remain officially unsolved. The files, reopened in later years, have yielded new interest but no convictions. Suspects have passed away, witnesses have grown old, memories fade like smoke over the ridge. And yet, the story endures, because stories like this are not easily buried. They settle in the soil, they cling to the moss, and in places like Keddie, they wait patiently. There is something enduring about places touched by mystery, not because they hold answers, but because they resist them, because they remind us that the past is not always willing to speak, and that silence can carry its own kind of weight. Cabin 28 is gone now. Its roof has collapsed into memory. Its walls have softened into moss and dust, but the story it held of Sue, of John, of Dana and Tina still drifts through the pines, not with urgency, not with fear, just presence. In towns like Keddie, the nights are long, the stars clear. The air carries the scent of cedar and snowmelt, and somewhere, if you stand still long enough, you might hear the hush of wind through needles, and the echo of footsteps that never quite reached the door. This mystery, like so many, may never be solved. The names may fade from headlines, the files may grow cold, but some stories do not vanish. They wait. And in the forests of the Sierra Nevada, under branches older than memory, this one still lingers, quiet, unresolved, and wrapped in the hush of pine. Now, rest and let the forest hold what remains. The forest settles again, just the trees, the night,